Did you know that Jesus had boundaries? He had healthy boundaries. We're going to talk about what boundaries are and how to properly set boundaries in our life. Jesus had boundaries. You know, when I first became aware of this idea of boundaries, it was because I encountered a boundary-breaking person. And this person was a retired pastor in one of my churches. I was a young pastor, and I found out later, much later, after talking to someone who knew him when he was a younger person, that this minister really was kind of a bitter person, and he had a chip on his shoulder because he always felt he had been slighted in ministry, that he didn't get the type of ministry positions that he wanted. And it ends up, as I kind of worked it out later and figured it out, it ends up that this man was jealous of me because I was young and I had a position I think that he had kind of always wanted. And while I had in my life surely had people that had broken boundaries before, I'd never really encountered it like this guy. I really thought about it, but this guy was so mean to me and disrespectful and inconsiderate of my feelings. And he would try to control me. It's almost like he tried to be the pastor by controlling me, by using guilt, try to guilt me into doing things. And he would gossip about me, and he was just really a mean person. And he totally did not care about my space and just was always in my face, so to speak, and walking all over me. And it was an awful feeling, and it was hard. I finally stood up to him one day. It was very difficult. But I've at different times struggled with boundaries in my life, and just like with so many things that I teach you, it's because it's what I'm learning or have learned. And just yesterday, a telemarketer called my wife's cell phone, and it's in the evening when she's trying to rest and she was doing other things. And telemarketers can be very rude, and it's an example of breaking boundaries. That person had not scheduled a phone call. That person had no idea if my wife was having a good day, or if this was a good time to talk, or if she was interested in the product. That person just calls and kind of tries to inject his life into whatever she's doing at that moment, and she's supposed to just be polite and just kind of allow him to ramble on for 10 minutes or whatever it was going to take. And I was so proud of her because she hung up on this person instead of thinking that she just has to listen and not be able to get a word in edgewise. And finally, 10 minutes later, then she'd say no. And then that was 10 minutes out of her evening that would be gone. You have no, you don't have to sit there and just take it, when a telemarketer calls because it's the Christian thing to do or whatever. We're going to talk about that actually also, but that's just an example of people that don't really care about your space. Imagine how weird it would be if we didn't have boundaries, let's say physical boundaries around our property. If you let's say you own a house, but there's no boundary lines, and you don't know where your neighbor's yard starts and where it ends. In fact, let's say no one has boundary lines. And so on a regular basis, there are people that camp in your yard right next to your bedroom window. They leave cans out in the yard, or there's people that park their cars, or people have loud music going on in your yard, playing volleyball or whatever. Just routinely, people are running in and out of your space. How weird and how odd that would be, and how that would make you feel as a person. Even houses have boundary lines so that we can properly separate ourselves from people. And we know where we begin and where others begin. And we don't go pulling up someone's tree belongs on their property, okay? So boundaries, very important. Here's actually a definition that we can look at and work at together. This definition says, a boundary is a limit or space between you and the other person, a clear place where you begin and the other person ends. The purpose of setting a healthy boundary is, of course, to protect and take good care of you. And that comes from Anne Catherine, who wrote a book called Where You End and Begin. Now, boundaries include, I'll just briefly touch on this point. Boundaries include, of course, people. There are people that are just toxic around you. There are people that are a bad influence, or people that are just totally insensitive to you. They don't seem to care how you're feeling, what you're going through. They're like a time bomb that can just say the most ridiculous, hurtful things. We need to have boundaries around those people. Your soul is a boundary, your spiritual soul. We live in a world that doesn't care much about the soul. It cares about other things. It cares about us making money, cares about us maybe being physically fit, but doesn't care much about the spiritual soul, or doesn't talk much about the soul. But we need to guard our soul and make sure that there are proper boundaries. Before that is your schedule. Obviously, we need to work at not allowing our schedule to crowd us out of us. It oftentimes is the choice between good and best. We need to make sure that we don't fill our schedule with so many good things that we don't allow ourselves to do the best things, or we don't protect ourselves from too many things in our life. Input is another boundary, like Facebook, for instance. Facebook is filled with people with bad boundaries, and we need to watch out for that. News, I just brought that up because it's just an example of something that I do. I'm really careful at, if I'm not feeling good emotionally, or I need some space, watching a news broadcast where everything primarily is negative is not really the best thing for my soul. So I need to watch myself. I need to create a boundary. I put radio next, but I just mean music. That's an example of making sure that we even think about that, of the stuff that we're putting into our heart, our soul, our mind, even musically. A boundary of not allowing just things that aren't going to be good in our spirit. Oh, those are just some ideas of boundaries. Here's what I want to encourage you in this lesson, though, and that is that, when you were a child, boundaries were set for you. Hopefully, if you had loving parents who were good parents, they set boundaries for you. They were always watching over you in that way. It was their responsibility to make sure you got enough sleep, to make sure you were listening to the right things, watching the right things, around the right people, not creating bad habits, all of that. Those are responsibilities of your parents, and it was their responsibility. Now, as an adult, nobody has this responsibility in your life. You hopefully will have some people that care about you that might encourage you and say some things if you're out of line in your boundaries, but it's nobody's sole responsibility except your own to create healthy boundaries. So let's do it, and let's talk first about what prevents us from good boundaries. One is fear. We're just so afraid of actually telling that person or changing that dynamic, or just saying this is how I need to be treated as a human being. This is how I will not be treated. And we're afraid of doing that because we think it's going to get worse if we do that. I'll just encourage you to understand, though, you are created to have boundaries, and you are not the person you need to be, and you're not going to be happy with bad boundaries. And even if it might be worse to set healthy boundaries at first, it might seem worse, it's going to be so much better in the end. Here's some questions you can just ask yourself. What are you actually afraid of? Really think about it. Instead of just this nebulous fear that kind of surrounds you, what are you really afraid of? And then, how likely is that to happen? It may happen, but it may not, and it may not be very likely. But even if it happens, I'm saying that it's worth for you to be you and who you're created with, to actually set proper boundaries. And, ask yourself, what will happen if you don't set a boundary in your life? How much worse can it get? It's going to probably get a lot worse, and you're not going to be happy. You're not going to be the person God created you to be. Ask yourself some things like that, and then think about your fear. Is it worth giving in to your fear? What prevents you from setting good boundaries? Low self-worth. You might have been raised that you weren't worth having good boundaries. You might be around a person now who has treated you that way for so long that you've just sort of believed it, and you just kind of say, well, what's the use? And your worth is so low that you don't think that you are worth having proper space for you as a person. And that might be a reason. Again, I just want to say you are worth it. And God doesn't want you to have to live this way. What prevents you from setting boundaries? People pleasing, of course, people pleasing. We're just so afraid to make somebody angry. We're so afraid to not do something that's going to please somebody. I finally came to the realization that not everybody's going to like me. That's just the way it is. Not everybody liked Jesus either. Just think about that for a little bit. And to think that you're going to get everybody to like you is ridiculous. You're just not. And so it's worth, if it takes somebody not being happy with you, or maybe not even liking you, it's worth it if it's going to give you your space and a healthy boundary. And finally, I'll just say this on what prevents you from having good boundaries. Well, it's guilt. A lot of times we get this idea, and if you're a Christian or you've raised in church, we get this idea wrongly that it's not a good Christian thing to do to have boundaries, that we are somehow just supposed to let ourselves get beat up all the time and walked on. And that's ridiculous. That's not what Christ wants for us. Sometimes we misinterpret this word meek in Scripture, which is one of the translations where in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are the meek. That doesn't mean doormat. It doesn't mean people that are walked on and abused and don't have a proper self-image or boundary line. Meek means gentle. It means blessed is the person that's gentle in God. Doesn't have to demand his or her own way. And gentle means power under control. So it doesn't have anything to do with this thought or this idea that you should feel guilty if you're not being walked on or if you stand up for yourself. That's just not the way it is. And actually, this is what I meant. The warped view of the Christian life. That's what I was really talking about. And when I said guilt, what I really should have mentioned, what I meant to say at this point was, you feel guilty if you set a boundary, but it's the guilt of others, really, that's the worst thing. You're afraid of the guilt, and they'll try to guilt you into not having proper boundaries. This is what people with improper boundaries do. They try to motivate you through guilt. They try to get what they want from you by making you feel guilty. And so again, the whole fear of the guilt trip and all of that causes us to not want to set boundaries. But the reality is, we need boundaries in our life because while we're powerful, God has created us with power, we're very fragile. Once a year in our church, we have a candlelight service at Christmas Eve, where at the end of the service, I will take a candle and light that candle, and I will walk 6 feet or so to another person in the congregation, and I will give that light or that candle flame to their candle that they're holding, and then they pass it on to someone else, and eventually the entire group of people have candles that they're holding. But here's what I always do, and this is instinctive, that when I walk that 6 feet, I have the candle and I go like this to guard that flame, because I know that while that flame is powerful, it's also yet very fragile. It's powerful enough that it could burn down an entire forest, but it's fragile. Like, it could be blown out very easily. And that's how our spirit is, and how God created us as people. He's given us a certain power, but there's this fragile flame of our being and our self that we have to protect by boundaries, because if we don't, we'll start to flicker very soon. Here's the thing. Jesus had boundaries. In Luke chapter 12, he basically says, this isn't my job description, and I'm not going to do it. Why do people have job descriptions? It's because of boundaries. It's so that you don't end up doing something you shouldn't be doing and abuse your own personal boundary. And other people shouldn't expect things of you that shouldn't be done and abuse your boundary. And so in Luke 12, Jesus is teaching. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus says, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" In other words, Jesus is saying, that's not what I came here to do. It's not why I came to this earth. It's not my role here to be an arbiter for your inheritance. I could do that. I'm smart enough and capable enough to figure it out, but I have to be wise with my energy and my time, and I can't go doing things like that. So Jesus is saying, that's not on my job description. I'm going to have a boundary and protect myself from things I don't need to be getting into. Here's another one in Luke chapter 5. Jesus would escape from the crowd. And it says, yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And this often happened where people would be pressing in against him and wanting him to just constantly be healing them and speaking and teaching to them. And Jesus, as a human being, fully God yet fully human, as a human being, he needed space and he needed boundaries. And so Jesus would escape and just get off to a lonely place, a place alone, and pray, so that he could regroup and his boundaries could be, his person could be restored. And that's all part of having boundaries. The most capable, powerful, altogether mature human being that's ever lived on this earth needed boundaries. So do you and I, of course. Let me clarify this, that I'm not saying to run from every tough person and situation. Sometimes God allows or places difficult people in our life to teach us, because it's the only way that we can learn certain things. So God sometimes does put situations, people that are difficult in our life, and all I'm saying is, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that every tough person or every tough situation, like, you just have to run. No. But around tough situations and people, we still must have boundaries, because that situation and those people will just run all over us if we don't have the proper boundaries. All right, so let me talk briefly here about setting these boundaries. I'll talk a little bit more, and it begins with some honest questions and answers. And by the way, I'm going to post my notes here on my website, 24today.org, so you can get these fully. There's also images online on Facebook that you can get these images as well. But 24today, that's the numbers 24, the word today.org, 24today.org. So here's the honest questions and answers. First, what does this dynamic or this relationship or this setting really do to me? I mean, think about it. Write it down. What does it really do to you? What's your heart doing? What are the palms of your hands doing? You get a headache. I mean, really, what does it do to you when your boundaries are overrun? I think that this, and seeing this, will help encourage you not to continue to let it happen. Second honest question and answer is this: how long does it take me or you to get back to zero after you've been with this person or in this situation or dynamic or setting? I mean, how long does it take for you to just get back to the starting point? How long does it take you to detox or flush the toxins of that situation or that toxic person out of your life? Does it take you the rest of that night? Does it take you the rest of the week? How long does it take? Thirdly, question and answer: is this good stewardship of your energies? Is this really a good way for you to be using the precious time and energy that God has given you in this life? Is it causing your flame to flicker? Number 4, ask yourself, what is this anyway? I mean, sometimes toxic people can masquerade themselves like as your best friend. So what is this really? Is it really a friend relationship? Is it really an empowering, healthy relationship? Some situations can be promoted as like really healthy and really good for you, but is it? I mean, what is it really? Is this a loyal person, or is this person really not? In setting boundaries, determine what boundaries you do have. I mean, you might have some, and just add to those if you do. You might not have any, but add slowly again. So with boundaries, don't expect to just have good boundaries with a person or a situation by the end of the week. Add this slowly, but think of something you can start doing to set boundaries. Secondly, don't feel that you have to explain yourself. A person with bad boundaries is going to want all kinds of explanations and why are you doing this and all that. You might not need to say anything. You might not even owe that to them. You might need to say it once quickly. You don't have to go into detail, but don't feel like you have to continue over and over and over and over and over every single time to explain yourself. You've said it there. How long does it usually take you before a boundary issue happens with this person or in this setting? You know, you go over to visit family On a holiday, how long does it usually take until you feel like your boundaries are violated? Does it take a half an hour? Does it take an hour? If it does, then you need to plan a shorter trip. If it usually happens like after dinner and it's later on in the day, then tell people ahead of time that you're only going to be there half a day. Protect yourself. Are there certain occurrences or typical occurrences or happenings or statements that seem to happen before every time that person or situation offends you? If so, think about what those are and let those sort of send an alarm in your head, like, okay, this is happening, so I need to do something to diffuse it. I need to get away. I need to whatever, make a phone call, whatever you need to do. But think about that. Schedule moments for your soul. Schedule soul moments, because they're not going to be done any other way. Probably put it on your calendar or your phone, soul moments or me time, whatever, so that you'll actually do these things. Consciously choose your sources of input, which is what I was saying about the news, just as an example, or the types of music you listen to. Don't just turn your radio on and think about what you need and what you don't need as a person. Jesus had boundaries. Do you? Do you have enough boundaries? Do you have boundaries in a lot of areas of life, but there's one that you don't, or two that you don't? It's where you need to start. You need this. Your flame is strong, but it's also very fragile. If Jesus needed to have boundaries, so must we. Think about it. Start doing some practical things. Check out my site, 24today.org, to be able to get my notes on this. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you again.